History has dictated few changes in the life of the United States Marine. His primary mission is still the winning of the battle. The battle is the culmination of months and years of preparation. Suddenly, all of those seemingly small, isolated moments of vigorous training on a small island near the southern tip of South Carolina known as Parris Island were put to the test in Vietnam. For in Vietnam, often under demanding conditions, the United States Marine Corps carried on their proud tradition of valor on the field of battle. From the time the first Marines came ashore in Vietnam, their area of operation included the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, dividing the South from North Vietnam. This had been one of the most heavily utilized infiltration routes into the South until the Marines arrived in the area. In the space of a few short months, they developed and built an interlocking system of fire bases and patrols which successfully challenged and ultimately blocked infiltration through this area. This forced the North Vietnamese to take the much harder and circuitous route down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Life on the DMZ was typically hours of boring duty such as guard or base maintenance, followed by moments of fierce combat as the communists probed the defenses for a weakness they could exploit. Patrolling between the fire bases and along the old infiltration routes was a never-ending task filled with the same tension and danger as elsewhere in this war. Booby traps and the danger of ambush filling the time and distance between the islands of security.
The United States Marine Corps, which plays a similar role to the Army, but is given a theater of operations in the north, up around I Corps and the DMZ and things like that. You'll find Marine forces not being used in their traditional role, which is to go in and establish a beachhead and the Army comes in, but instead you'll find Marine forces in for the duration of the combat. They're in there, they're the same kind of rotation as the Army, doing the same kinds of missions as the Army, and it takes some modification of organization and equipment for the Marine Corps to be able to do that.
This then was life for the Marines, who occupied what came to be known derisively to the American troops as the McNamara Wall, after Defense Secretary Robert McNamara's announced policy of isolating South Vietnam from infiltration using systematic fortifications and technology. Marine activity in the South was not confined to the DMZ, of course. They roamed the entire area of operations, seeking to take the war to the enemy. These Marines have just returned from a tough battle in the north. They're now in a defensive perimeter. Their weapons are cleaned and cared for before a thought can be given to personal comfort, a matter of importance in the life of a professional fighting man. This is neither a clean nor an easy life for these Marines, but they learn to accept the physical hardships of battle as their fathers did before them. In their famous hymn, Marines recount battles fought in every clime and place. Here in Vietnam, except for snow, they prove it. From the soft ooze of the rice paddies, they move on through swift-running canals and streams, then push forward into the jungles that fringe the mountains, where tropical leaves tear at the skin, while vines tangle the feet and giant trees cut out the sun. But it's not just a matter of long walks in the tropical heat. Each and every step must be a cautious one, for the Viet Cong have prepared the way with mines and booby traps. So the Marines had to watch every step. A false one and an ankle could be pierced by the nails of a crudely cunning trap that only digs deeper as the soldier fights to pull it away. A hidden shell sits waiting for the unwary foot. and a soldier never knew which innocent-looking piece of grass or fern was a pit of sharpened, poison-tipped spikes. Marine engineers constantly swept the roads and rails in search of killer mines. The troops must provide a screen of security behind which Americans can assist the Vietnamese in the revolutionary rebuilding of their nation. It's necessary to constantly patrol the outlying villages and countryside to deny re-entry to the Viet Cong. Marines initiated literally hundreds of small patrols and ambushes throughout the I Corps area each week. One of the most difficult jobs in this war without a front was to distinguish friend from foe. Each person must be carefully searched and identified. Whether VC are turned up by such scrutiny or captured in combat, they're treated with scrupulous fairness under the international rules of the Geneva Convention. Marines have found that such treatment of an often cruel enemy frequently results in the proffering of information that reveals the whereabouts of an enemy force. That information can lead to yet another battle with the North Vietnamese. The test of combat is the culmination of months and years of preparation. A few days, a few hours when mobility, firepower, and leadership must take on a definitive pattern within the framework of a calculated risk. A pattern that not only acknowledges the strengths and weaknesses of the enemy, but also the time and the place where he can be defeated. The time, 0630, September 7th, 1965. Mission, Operation Piranha, a 4-day search and destroy action by combined United States and Vietnamese military forces against a suspected stronghold of 2,000 Viet Cong guerrillas on the twin peninsulas of La Tongan and Hong Kee, 20 miles south of Chu Lai. For the men of the 1st Battalion, 7th Regiment, this was the sort of operation for which all Marines were qualified. Born of time, necessity, and circumstance, and nurtured to near perfection under fire during the Pacific Campaign of World War II, the amphibious assault has become the trademark of the Navy Marine Corps team, a symbol of their role in America's combat readiness. But even before the 1st Battalion had begun to assemble at its debarking stations at sea, the men of the 3rd Battalion, 7th were forming up into helicopter slicks, proportioned for loading quickly at the hastily constructed helipad near the outskirts of Chu Lai. This was the vertical envelopment doctrine, or heliborne assault, in operation. Utilizing 3 centrally controlled helicopter squadrons, the men of the 3rd Battalion were airlifted to Landing Zone Oak, a strip of elevated ground running across the twin throats of La Tongan and Hong Kee. From here, they would act as a blocking force to stop the retreating Viet Cong as the 1st Battalion began its push from the beach. With the landing of the first wave of Marines, 16 of the choppers broke away from Landing Zone Oak and sped 10 miles south to the Republic of Vietnam's stronghold at Bien Huy. There, they began to lift 2 Vietnamese battalions to landing zones Pine and Birch, located on the far side of the Song Cha Ma Song River. By 0945, the vertical envelopment was completed and a stranglehold pulled across the bases of La Tongan and Hong Kee. The line is stretched for a full 8 miles. By late morning, advanced Marine patrols had already moved in from the beach to their first objectives, and others are formed up ready to follow. On the outskirts of villages like Cha Mei Wong, civilians were quickly gathered together for safe transportation to secure areas. As they moved off, the Marines stopped small groups and asked the same question over and over again: where are the Viet Cong? The answer that came back was always the same: they're gone. They left before you came. The expected Viet Cong resistance at the beaches had never materialized. And now, further inland, only scattered sniper fire broke the calm. This was the penalty the Marines had to pay for their own efficiency. The very strength of United States firepower that had won so many victories in the past had driven the Viet Cong to cover or full retreat. The possibility of any large contact with the enemy was going to be harder and harder to come by. As night fell on their first day ashore, the Marines dug in and waited. Finally, the word came back. Only 4 Viet Cong killed, 6 captured, 48 suspects being held. It was evident that an old familiar pattern of battle was taking shape. 3 of the 4 Viet Cong killed on the previous day had been flushed from a cave. This could mean only one thing. The Viet Cong were there all right, but they would have to be dug and blasted out. One key to search and destroy operations like this one was the jet hop pad at Chu Lai. Standing on strip alert, Marine attack jets were only minutes away from a platoon leader's radio call for an airstrike. With almost any lethal combination of weapons he might want or need, from 20mm aircraft cannon and high-velocity rockets or bombs. For the first time in Marine Corps history, control of the air support element was handled by Marines circling above the battlefield in a KC-130 Hercules at 18,000 feet. Its crews monitored requests from ground forces and assigned aircraft to requested strike areas where they were controlled by aerial or ground observers. But if the innovations of the jet airstrike were important to the success of the Piranha campaign, the backbone of the attack was still the man on the ground. The man with a singular philosophy embodied in the words leadership and discipline. Combat is a test of courage and endurance. It's a disciplined struggle for life, hinging on the control of those who command and the loyalty of those who follow. By the end of the second day, the Marines had confirmed 70 Viet Cong killed, 4 captured. By the end of the third day, all Viet Cong resistance was broken. One by one, the caves were opened up and the enemy routed out. When the smoke had cleared from one hole, the Marines discovered, to their amazement, a limestone cavern over 60 feet high and 250 feet long. This underground complex yielded up the bodies of 66 dead Viet Cong. This was the largest single discovery for the Marines since their arrival in Vietnam. By September 10th, it was all over. The La Tong Don and Hong Kee were secure. The 4-day total casualties for the operation were 198 Viet Cong killed, 38 enemy captured, 265 VC suspects detained. The cost, 1 Marine dead, 8 wounded. Probably the most famous battle for the Marines in Vietnam occurred in the northwest corner of South Vietnam. There, nestled in thick jungle foliage, was the small valley of Khe Sanh. From January 31st to March 31st, 1968, it was the scene of one of the most bitterly fought and highly publicized battles of the Vietnam War. For 70 days and nights, a determined group of 6,000 United States Marines and Allied troops held out against a besieging force of 20,000 North Vietnamese.
Khe Sanh is a battle that's kind of, it's interesting. There's different ways of approaching it based on where you were and what you heard at the time. To understand the one aspect of Khe Sanh, you have to go back to what ended the war for the French in Southeast Asia. And that was a battle called Dien Bien Phu, where a bunch of French paratroopers and colonial troops got inserted into an area of Viet Minh control. They got surrounded, cut off, they were besieged, they had to be supplied by air, and ultimately they were unable to hold out and they were captured, and that ended the French involvement in the war for all intents and purposes. Well, Khe Sanh is kind of like that in some ways. It's a valley, just like Dien Bien Phu is, and so the American High Command will put a Marine base into this valley, and they'll take hills and fortify the hills, which is what the French had done earlier. And the idea is, the same as with the French, that they're putting the people there to control North Vietnamese infiltration into the south, and they know there's a buildup going on by the intelligence efforts, and they're trying to head that buildup off. Well, what'll happen is the Vietnamese will deploy 2 divisions, and they'll surround Khe Sanh and they'll cut it off. And there'll be a siege there, and the Marines will hold out against these odds. There'll be tremendous application of American firepower, a lot of aviation that'll be supplied from the air, initially by landing the transports and later by dropping supplies in at some points. And then the siege will be lifted ultimately, and the American ground forces will cut through on the land route, and it'll all be over.
In the summer of 1967, the Battle of Khe Sanh was still months away, but units of the U.S. Navy Seabees were already at work on the airstrip that would provide the only link with the outside during the battle. Marines were busy digging trenches and building bunkers. The weeks that followed were relatively quiet. Marine units continued their patrol operations with very little enemy resistance or contact. In December of 1967, intelligence sources indicated the start of an enemy buildup. 2 North Vietnamese divisions were assembling in the jungle areas around the base. Intelligence indicated that the communists were preparing for a major assault. A decision was made by General William Westmoreland, top commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam. The Marines would stay and fight. He was supported by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. If the base was to be defended, reinforcements were needed.
Khe Sanh was an important outpost. If the enemy had taken this outpost, I think the province of Quang Tri and the DMZ area would have been in jeopardy. The enemy had planned to take it as part of his Tet Offensive. At the same time, he had planned to overrun Quang Tri City, seize and Ho Way, and to roll up our defenses south of the demilitarized zone. If he could have seized that plateau, he could have run trucks with ammunition, logistics, and even conventional artillery into the Khe Sanh plateau and certain of our installations further to the east. could have been made untenable. Now, we saw the enemy building up his forces in order to siege and eventually overrun Khe Sanh as he did Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The weather was very poor. In October, we had only 1 battalion there. In November, we increased it to 2 battalions. December, we kept 2 battalions there, but in January, we reinforced it with 2 more battalions, all Marines. We then put a Ranger battalion in there. I wanted to put into Khe Sanh enough troops that I thought could hold it against ground attack. But I didn't want to put more troops in there than we could supply by air.
Khe Sanh and Dien Bien Phu. The comparison was natural. In fact, the American press was utilized to publicize the comparison in hopes of drawing an NVA attack. It was hoped the enemy could be drawn into a battle where American firepower would be decisive. August of 1954, Dien Bien Phu. French paratroops had moved into the Vietnamese stronghold, then a part of French Indochina, located in North Vietnam. But the French found themselves outmanned and outfought. The end was inevitable. The French were overrun, forced to capitulate. The defeat brought an end to the Indochina War. 2 months later, the armistice agreement was signed at Geneva. Vietnam was partitioned. Laos and Cambodia neutralized. The Russian communists were quick to congratulate the victors, Ho Chi Minh and his brilliant general, Giap. Now, 15 years later, the same General Giap is determined to repeat his victory at Khe Sanh. By January 1968, the stage was set. Inside the 1 mile by 1/2 mile perimeter of the Marine garrison were 6,000 U.S. Marines, a battalion of South Vietnamese Rangers, and a handful of Air Force and CB support troops. Burrowed in bunkers and hidden under the triple canopied foliage that covered the surrounding slopes was the largest and best equipped force ever mustered by the enemy, 20,000 North Vietnamese Army troops. On the 19th of January, a recon patrol had gone out to this general area north of Hill 881 North and run into considerable trouble. Eventually, U.S. forces were able to get them out and brought them back to Hill 881 South. Then on the morning of the 21st, about 5 o'clock in the morning, the base received heavy mortar, rocket, and artillery fire. Almost simultaneously, Hill 861 came under attack from about a battalion-sized NVA force. And that no sooner got started than in Khe Sanh Village, a KAC unit came under attack by a battalion of NVA regulars. The siege was on. The North Vietnamese launched a massive artillery attack. The Americans countered with record numbers of airstrikes and artillery. The B-52s started their aerial bombardment. The U.S. commanders predicted a major North Vietnamese offensive just before the Lunar New Year on January 30th, or just after it. This might be the biggest confrontation of the war. The weather was on the side of the North Vietnamese. Communist gunners timed their attacks to take advantage of the mist closing in on the airfield that hampered American planes from striking back at them. January 29th, American intelligence reported the presence of a 4th North Vietnamese regular division in the Khe Sanh area, bringing the total estimated enemy strength in the area to approximately 40,000 regular troops. Half of these appeared poised for the attack on the garrison. General Westmoreland positioned his reserve of about 15,000 Army troops plus a 5,000-man Marine regiment at Phu Bai, about 60 miles southwest of Khe Sanh, along the ground route to the besieged garrison. In early February, the enemy again tried to take Hill 861 complex. The attack on that hill was repelled through the use not only of the supporting arms of artillery and airstrikes, but also, as with every other attack, the 81-millimeter mortars, the 3.5 rockets, the M60 machine guns, M79 grenade launchers, and mines, and every other weapon available to an infantry battalion. February 10th, the North Vietnamese Communist Party newspaper boasted that the U.S. faced a defeat as disastrous as that suffered by the French at Dien Bien Phu. There was growing concern over the fate of the Marine garrison as the U.S. press also revived the specter of Dien Bien Phu. At stake was more than a key military stronghold. The Communists were out to inflict heavy casualties on the American troops with a major victory so that the U.S. would enter negotiations on terms favorable to Hanoi. U.S. strategists were looking to draw the Vietnamese into a set battle and blunt the projected offensive. Unlike the French, U.S. forces were prepared, equipped, and supported to win the contest. Khe Sanh could call on devastating firepower. The Americans had protection from big 175-millimeter guns at Camp Caro, about 17 miles to the east, and at the Rock Pile, about 12 miles to the northeast. Inside the garrison, the troops had a handful of tanks, anti-tank weapons, 4.2-inch mortars, and about 20 artillery pieces, including 105 and 155-millimeter howitzers. But their secret weapon was their air power. Fighter bombers of the Navy, Marines, and Air Force capable of mounting over 600 sorties a day, plus the terrifying power of B-52 bombers that could drop 500 and 750-pound bombs during 50 bomb runs a day. They could destroy entire map grid squares at one time. And then there were the supply planes, giant C-130s and 123s that built a lifeline through the shrapnel-infested skies to keep the Marines supplied with food, ammunition, medical supplies, building materials, even mail from home. Khe Sanh was never cut off from supply or support.
And according to our calculations, we could supply Khe Sanh by parachute drop, and we had prepared ourselves for this contingency some 18 months before. During the ensuing period, I had required the commanders to rely from time to time on aerial resupply to practice the system and get the pilots accustomed to dropping these supplies in all weather conditions. So when the time arrived, we were able to supply that garrison of some 5,000 people. We had built up an airfield that would take C-130s. And we put radar on the airfield, or GCA actually, so that we could bring in C-130s and 123s in all weather. And when it got too hot for them to land, having lost a couple of C-130s, then we started bringing them in for low-level extraction, where the supplies would be dropped or let to the ground from the air platform by parachute. The result, of course, was that we supplied them.
February 13th, Marine casualties mounted when a U.S. Marine platoon was ambushed by the Viet Cong 800 yards outside the barbed wire. Throughout the month of February, the North Vietnamese artillery continued to pound the garrison. Some of their guns were dug into caves across the Laotian border 10 miles away and were believed to include 130-millimeter and 152-millimeter guns and rockets. The Americans countered with airstrikes and B-52 bombers, pinpointing the advancing communists only yards from the base perimeter and bringing the strikes in dangerously close to the defenders.
The Marines were told to button up. I told them to confine their patrols to close-in patrols for their own security, because I did not want them venturing too far afield where men would get killed and wounded or lost, so that we could not afford to put our firepower in the area where we knew they were located. And we started pouring on. And that's the thought that came to mind when I call this Operation Niagara. And this is exactly what happened. The bomb fell all the months of February and all the months of March.
Arclight was the code name for B-52 bombers from Guam. The North Vietnamese troops referred to them as Silent Death, and were forced to dig in, keep their heads down, and concentrate on avoiding being scorched by napalm or pulverized by the bombs. When bad weather came, or at night, the U.S. aircraft bombed by radar, pinpointing their targets by means of a ground control system called Sky Spot. February 22nd, troop movements indicated that the enemy was massing for the long-awaited attack. The defenders waited it out in sandbagged bunkers and trenches, positions surrounded by tangled coils of barbed wire studded with explosive charges and claymore mines. The incoming artillery fire, rockets, and mortars of the enemy continued to pound the garrison. In Saigon and Honolulu, watch teams manning the war rooms waited throughout the weekend of March 3rd, expecting word that the anticipated communist assault had been launched. From the communist viewpoint, the weather conditions seemed ideal. American intelligence reports indicated that the all-out attack would come early Monday morning, but it did not develop. Apparently, the communists were unable to mass their troops for the attack because of the airstrikes and heavy bombardment. Also, the Marines still controlled the high ground, guarding the approaches to Khe Sanh, hills 881, 861, 950, and 558. The enemy was unable to take any of them, as they had done at Dien Bien Phu. March 13th. This was the 14th anniversary of General Giap's attack on Dien Bien Phu, and time was running out for the communists. The Marines spent a relatively quiet day waiting and watching. Because of the resupply effort, the Marines never ran out of sea rations. You could take a walk through the trench lines and bunkers and find an array of menus being prepared. March 26th, the enemy closed in, digging tunnels and working their trenches closer to the base perimeter. 5 times they probed the garrison's defenses, hitting the perimeter in battalion strength. But each time they were thrown back. The enemy was still unable to mass the necessary strength for the all-out attack. March 27th, the enemy withdrew one of its 2 divisions, and substantial elements were withdrawn from the 2nd North Vietnamese unit. The Marines moved out of their trenches and bunkers to seek and engage the enemy on the ground.
And on the 1st of April, the weather broke. We were able to exercise our contingency plan by moving the 1st Cavalry Division, reinforced by a regiment of Marines, up Highway 9 to make a ground link-up, and the Marine engineers opened Highway 9, and we've been rolling trucks over it ever since.
Operation Pegasus, a 30,000-man relief unit, was a joint force composed of the 1st Air Cavalry Division of the U.S. Army, Marines, and South Vietnamese troops. Sweeping down the narrow highway from the north, they saw little of the two North Vietnamese divisions that had surrounded the base. The enemy had left, silently pulled out and given up the battle, leaving in his wake a charred and churned up landscape, blown up and destroyed bridges that had to be rebuilt before the convoy could proceed, and hidden mines that had to be found and exploded. Fleets of helicopters lifted men and artillery into the hills surrounding the base. And on April 7th, lead elements of the relief troops walked into the base at Khe Sanh. The ground route was again open, and the long siege was over.
It is my conservative estimate that 15,000 men were knocked out of action during that period of time. The result was that we broke his back, and he has not regained his strength since. We captured documents on the battlefield that attest to this. And we've learned from these documents that we not only killed a lot of the enemy and destroyed great quantities of his supplies, but we also made it so hot in that area that he was having great difficulty with desertion. Up to 20 to 25% of companies, according to these documents, deserted and just took off. And I think this is the first time in history where a siege of that magnitude has ever been broken by air power. But it was. And once it was broken by air power, and this was our strategy, it was exploited by a ground operation. But his back had been virtually broken when the ground troops arrived.
The aerial bombardment of the North Vietnamese at Khe Sanh was the most intense in the history of the Vietnam War. In all, from January 19th until March 31st, more than 103,000 tons of bombs were dropped on the besieging enemy force. Navy, Air Force, and Marine pilots flew more than 24,000 sorties, including 2,500 by B-52s. In addition, the enemy was pounded by more than 100,000 rounds of artillery and mortar fire. After Marine units moved out of Khe Sanh into the surrounding terrain, they discovered hundreds of North Vietnamese bodies in shallow graves. Total enemy casualties for the period were estimated at more than 15,000. Marine losses were 204 killed and over 1,000 wounded who had been evacuated.
At the time, I remember Khe Sanh being talked about as another Dien Bien Phu, and a lot of fear in the American press over what was going to happen to this force that was cut off in the central highlands of Vietnam. But if you go back and look through military communications and higher levels at the time, a clear strategy of putting Americans at Khe Sanh to lure the Vietnamese into a siege-type operations so that we can use the air power against the besieging forces. Air power far beyond the capabilities of the French, because technology had changed and because we had more equipment available. And so it seems to me that the Khe Sanh is really a trap for the North Vietnamese that they fall for, and it causes them a lot of casualties. And arguments have been made that Khe Sanh took those two divisions effectively out of the Tet Offensive, and it would have been a lot worse had they been involved in it.
On May 23rd at the White House in Washington, D.C., the 26th Marine Regiment and its reinforcing units were cited by the President for their gallant fighting and countless acts of individual heroism in defending Khe Sanh. Colonel David E. Lowndes, the commanding officer of the Marine post, received the Navy Cross. And Sergeant Major A.W. Smith, senior enlisted Marine at the base, was awarded the Bronze Star.
Some have asked, what the gallantry of these Marines and airmen accomplished? Why did we choose to pay the price to defend those dreary hills? The fortress at Khe Sanh straddled critical supply and infiltration routes that the North Vietnamese were using. Route 9, which it commanded, was to be a major avenue for the enemy into populated areas and into the cities of South Vietnam. by pinning down and by decimating 2 North Vietnamese divisions. The few thousand Marines and their gallant South Vietnamese allies prevented those divisions from entering other major battles, such as those for Hue and Quang Tri. I believe that our initiative toward talks with North Vietnam was greatly strengthened by what these men did at Quezon, for they vividly demonstrated to the enemy the utter futility of his attempts to win a military victory in the South. Brave men such as the 26th Marines will carry on the fight for freedom in Vietnam, and soon, God willing, they will come home. We would like nothing more than to see that day, but until they do, we shall express at moments such as these, on behalf of all our American people, our great gratitude for the protection they have given us and our great appreciation for their selfless bravery.
There's a lot of very tough questions about the Vietnam War and the impact on the American veterans of the war. What has that done to them? Have the wounds healed? Those kinds of questions are really, really hard to answer. There's no doubt about the fact that this was a war that, because of its unpopularity and its length of time and all those things, that this is a war unlike any other that we fought. And its impact on the veterans is similar. There's a wide range of impacts. I've run into veterans who've had severe psychological problems because of the war and because of their experiences in the war. On the other hand, I've run into the majority of the veterans that I've run into haven't had those kind of problems. Talk about Agent Orange difficulties and talk about the homelessness caused by that, or the it seems like every time a postal worker picks up a gun, he's a Vietnam vet. Those kinds of issues, I'm not sure how to answer those questions. I know for me the war is still there, but it's in the back of my mind. I think it's something that most veterans wanted to put behind them when they came back. They came back from the war. Wasn't any big crowd. There wasn't a lot of big welcome. You weren't particularly complimented or praised for what you'd done. And so they wanted to kind of put that on the back shelf, get it out there behind them. And there's a lot of reluctance on the part of those veterans to even talk about their experiences in the war. And there's probably some crossover between that and this question of, well, did we win? Because for most people, that war was unpopular, it was a losing effort, and most Americans don't want to be involved in something that we lost in. So it tends to get put aside. Have those wounds healed? You know, for some people, no. And for some people, they never will.
When the final battle was won in Vietnam, the Americans were not there. After years of national debate, the Americans left Vietnam to the victorious North. But it is a fact that in most cases, with the help of young Americans like those who served in the Marine Corps, the individual battles were won. The war was lost, not on the battlefield, but in the halls of Congress and in the media portrayals in the living rooms across the United States.